This week I've been thinking about enemies, my long list of enemies, all the enemies that I've accumulated over the years. And the reason I've been thinking about that is because if you've been reading along in our chronological Bible reading plan, there's a lot in there about enemies. I mean, we're in the Psalms, we're in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, and we're reading through this text, and it seems like somebody's always got an enemy. And in the Psalms, David had enemies. And if you read the Psalms, he's praying always about his enemies, but not nice things for them. He's praying God's judgment on his enemies. He's praying for relief from his enemies. He's praying for retribution against his enemies. In fact, I pulled this. This is from Psalm 140, and this is David. This is his prayer to God about his enemies. May burning coals fall on them. May they be thrown into the fire, into miry pits, never to rise. I mean, it's pretty intense, right? And then I was looking through the Psalms, and I found one. Now, we haven't come to this in our reading yet, but it just seemed like kind of a Mother's Day verse, and I'm going to read to you from Psalm 137. This isn't David. This is somebody writing later in Israel, and he says, "Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks." I mean, happy Mother's Day to you. There is some intense stuff in the Old Testament about enemies. So I've been thinking about my enemies. I mean, because there's a lot in Scripture about enemies. And it turns out, I don't think I have any enemies. I mean, I thought about it, and I prayed about it, and I told you guys last week about the driver of that black Mercedes who was tailgating me, and I slammed my brakes. I mean, maybe that guy's my enemy. I don't know. I wouldn't recognize him if I saw him, but I was a little upset at the way he was driving, but I don't think I want to take his baby and smash him against a rock. I mean, I don't think I have enemies because I'm a Christian, and I try to live at peace with everybody. I think I live a pretty enemy-free life. I mean, there's people that don't return my calls. Maybe I made them a little bit mad, or maybe they just don't like me. I don't know, but I couldn't give you a list of 10 enemies that I have, let alone even one or two. And I bet, so as I was thinking about this, I bet that you're the same way. I bet if I were to ask you for a list of your enemies, you would have a hard time coming up with your enemies. Because like me, you just try to live at peace with everybody. Now, let's be honest. Some of us, we've got that one family member. He's a little bit crazy. She's a little bit nuts. And maybe that particular person's not invited to your family get-together. I mean, maybe that's an enemy. And I know that in a room of this size, some of you have stories that would boggle my mind. If you were to tell me your story and I were to write it down, I wouldn't want to share it with anybody because there's so much pain and hurt. And maybe you've got an enemy, but if you do, the list isn't that long, right? And so I don't think that most of us have any enemies. In fact, in our class this morning at 9:30, by the way, you guys are missing out. I keep telling you every week, you're here for the worship service. All you're doing is listening to me. In class, you get to talk. So we're talking, and I said, any of you guys have any enemies? I'm looking around the table. Nobody had any enemies, except for one with a crazy family member. But I mean, in general, nobody had any enemies. I mean, we don't have people that we hate so much that we want to kill their children. We're just not those people. So as I'm thinking about it, I started to think a little bit more. I asked myself a different question. This is the question I asked. I don't have any enemies, but I wonder if there are people who think that I think they are my enemies. Now, I'm going to have to do that a couple more times because it's kind of hard to get. And we had to do this more than once in the class this morning, too. So I know I've got to go slow with it, but here's the idea. Is there someone in my life, I don't view them as an enemy, but he or she thinks that I view them that way? Is there someone I don't think of as an enemy, but that person thinks that I think they're my enemy? And I'm going to tell you what, the answer to that question, that's yes. And it's yes for me, and it's yes for you. And so what I want to do this morning is I'm going to give you a few examples of what I mean. And I'm going to tell you a couple stories, then I'm going to give you some examples, and we're going to talk about that idea. So I want to tell you the story of a person. I'm going to name her Jill. That's not really her name. My family will recognize who this is right away. It's somebody that we met in Miami years ago when we lived there. And I was a pastor at a church, And I was there in the morning, and the receptionist calls. This is a pretty big church. And the receptionist calls my office, and she says, hey, Ken, there's somebody here that wants to see a pastor, and I can't find any other ones. Can you do it? I'm like, okay, thanks. Appreciate that. So I'm going to call this woman, Jill. She comes into my office, and Jill sits down, and Jill starts to tell me her story. Jill, it turns out, is a single mother of 2 Jordanian boys. She's Jordanian. And she starts to tell me the story of how she's in the United States, and there's this whole, I can't even remember the whole thing. It's kind of complicated, honestly. But she's telling me this story, but she kind of starts out with this. This is what she says. You know, I'm a Muslim, and I know this is a church, and I know that you're a Christian, and you don't have any reason to help me, and so I'm pretty sure that I'm just wasting my time by being here. No, I'd never met Jill before, hadn't met her, didn't know her from anyone, really. But her idea of me was that I perceived her as someone that I would not help because she's Jordanian, because she's Muslim, because she's a single woman, I don't know. But she came into that office thinking she was coming into the office of someone who viewed her as an enemy. What about another guy, John? I met John after I moved to Franklin. Now, I'm just going to tell you, we moved to Franklin, and then so we're living here, and I needed to find a hair salon. So I found one. It's a great hair salon. In fact, I know it's great because that's what they call it. It's Great Clips. That's the name of my hair salon. So I'm going to Great Clips. Hey, look, do you think this is easy? I mean, this takes some work, okay? So I'm in Great Clips, and I'm getting to know the people that are there. And one day I go in, and there's a hairstylist, a barber. I'm going to call him John. That's not his name, in case you ever go to this hair salon. And John, and when I see him immediately, I'd never seen him before, and what I realize about John right away is that John fits the stereotype of what you might think of as a hairstylist, because John is someone I would trust around my daughter, but not necessarily around my son, if you understand what I mean. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm in his chair, and I'm actually having this mental dialogue thinking, what is the correct and proper way for a Christian to respond to a homosexual? How is it, what do I think about him? And maybe more importantly, if I want to have a conversation with John, what does John think that I think about him? In other words, what relational hurdle am I going to need to get past to even have a conversation? And you might resonate with a couple of those examples, but I'm going to go through about 4 or 5, 6 more of them. And by the time we get to the end of this, I might have offended you. And you know what? That's your blessing for being here today. So here's my idea. If you're a Republican, I think that there are Democrats that think that you view them as an enemy. And if you're a Democrat, I think that there are Republicans who think that you view them as an enemy. I think Scripture has very clear teachings on abortion and what God thinks of the killing of unborn children. If in this room you are anti-abortion, I can almost guarantee that there's a pro-choice person somewhere, more than one, a man, a woman, who thinks that because of your stance on that issue, you view her or him as an enemy. Let me take it one step further. If you're anti-abortion, I bet there's someone that has had an abortion, that your stance on that issue would be a relational barrier. And this isn't the sermon about abortion or homosexuality. That's not my point. My point is that there's people that are different than you that think you view them as an enemy. So even if you don't have enemies, you've got enemies. Do you understand? I got more people on my list. Here's another one, nationality. I mean, most of us here are Americans. You know that there's people in the world that think that just because you're American, you hate them? And sometimes they probably think that with good reason. And some of those people, by the way, live here in the United States. If you're rich, there's poor people that think you view them as an enemy. If you're poor, you think that rich people view you as an enemy. If you're really, really smart, there's people that aren't as smart as you that think you look down on them. And they view you with suspicion, sometimes with contempt. Did I get everybody? I mean, because what I want you to do in this moment is I want you to think of an individual, a name. It could be a coworker. It could be someone that you come across. I want you to have that in your mind, not an abstract person, but a name or a face, or even potentially a people group, a characteristic, a belief. And I want to be clear as we're going through this, disagreement over an issue does not make us enemies. That's not my point. And that's especially true from your point of view, because this is what we say, well, you know, I love that person, I just don't like what he stands for. I love that person, I just don't like what she believes. And that's true it's not necessarily how that person thinks that you think. You may not have enemies, but there are absolutely people who think that they are your enemy. So the question for the day is this: how do we treat our enemies? And I gave you that really long introduction to let you know that if you can't think of your enemies, this sermon is for you, not for the people who can name a top 5 hit list. Because there are people that think they are our enemies, and we all have them. And I want to let you know as we get started, there is going to be an amazing visual aid for this sermon. You're just going to have to wait until the end, okay? So stay tuned. You got to listen to everything. And what we're going to be talking about this morning is David, the example of David as David deals with an enemy. And we're going to be looking at a passage of Scripture you may not have seen before. You will have read it, but the names are hard. And if you're reading it in our plan, you might have just gone right through it. But we're going to be looking at perhaps the clearest picture of the gospel in the Bible that's not actually the gospel. Because this is the account of David and a man named Mephibosheth. Now, Mephibosheth, just so we're clear on this, that's Hebrew. And that word means difficult name for an English-speaking pastor to pronounce. So, if I mispronounce Mephibosheth, you're going to give me a pass unless I do it more than 3 times. Okay, so this is what we learn about Mephibosheth in the Bible. King Saul was the first king of Israel. You remember, and God takes the kingdom away from him, but not before Saul has a son named Jonathan. And Jonathan and King David, we've been looking at the life of King David. Jonathan and King David were tight. They were the best of friends. They were like brothers. In fact, some men in here have brothers that you don't have as good a relationship with as Jonathan and David had. In fact, they were so tight that David made a promise to Jonathan and went like this: Jonathan, if you're killed, I'm going to take care of your family. It was a promise, an oath that David made to his best friend. Well, it turns out that, in fact, he is killed. Saul the king and Jonathan his son, who, except for the anointing of David, would be the heir apparent of the kingdom, are killed in battle. And that news reaches the nurse, the nanny of Jonathan's son, Mephibosheth. And she is worried for her life and for the life of her young charge. And we read about what happens in 2 Samuel 4, verse 4. We're putting it up there on the screen. It says, Saul's son Jonathan had a son whose feet were crippled. He was 5 years old when the report about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel. That means that they heard that Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle. His nanny picked him up and fled, but as she was hurrying to flee, he fell and became lame. His feet were injured, and his name was Mephibosheth. Now, you know, because you've been reading and we've talked about it, that David ends up taking the throne. He becomes the king of Israel, and it's kind of the golden age of this nation. And David remembers his promise to Jonathan, that I'm going to look out for your family. And Jonathan, if you die, I'm going to take care of your kids. And so we pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 9, and this is verse 1. I'm going to read these a few verses at a time. David asked, is there anyone remaining from the family of Saul I can show kindness to for Jonathan's sake? There was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba. They summoned him to David, and the king said to him, hey, are you Ziba? And I am your servant, he replied. In other words, yes, I am. What is it that I'm going to do for you? And the king asked, is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can show the kindness of God to? And Ziba said to the king, there is still Jonathan's son who was injured in both feet. Now, we got to pause here, because you may not realize it because you're just so used to hearing Scripture read in church. This is really weird. This passage of Scripture is really, really strange. And here's the reason. It's because it was not customary for kings to show kindness to the sons or the grandsons of the kings that had preceded them. In fact, at this time and in this place, the actual custom would have been, if you became king, find all the relatives of the guy who was king before you and kill him off. You might do that even if you were related to them. It was a way of consolidating power, because there are many people who would have thought Mephibosheth, I mean, he's probably about 20 years old by now, Mephibosheth, that man could be a threat, because, there's people that remember the kingdom of Saul, and there's People might not like David as king, and so maybe they want that guy back. Maybe Mephibosheth has designs on the throne. Maybe there's people around him that want to manipulate his name and his bloodline to gain some advantage. So what would be customary would not be to show kindness, but to instead hunt down the relatives of your rival and kill them. But that isn't what David does. David remembers his promise, but I want you to think of this from the point of view of Mephibosheth, because Mephibosheth believes that David thinks of him as an enemy. David is looking for a way to show kindness as a result of a promise. Mephibosheth is living in fear that he will be called into the presence of the king. And this is what happens. We continue reading in verse 4. The king asked him, "Where is he?" And Ziba answered the king, "You'll find him in Lo-debar at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel." So King David had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, fell face down, and paid homage. And David said, "Mephibosheth, I am your servant," he replied. Now, what do you think is going through Mephibosheth's mind right now? This is the man who has all the power. He is holding my life in his hands. In fact, I would make an argument that Mephibosheth came into the presence of David defenseless, no allies, no weapons, at David's complete mercy. He came dependent because Mephibosheth, remember this, he's injured. He can hardly walk, if he can walk at all. And in this society, in this culture at this time, your worth as a man was largely determined by what you can do. Can you farm? Can you hunt? Can you fight? Mephibosheth, he can't do any of that stuff. He is completely dependent on the largesse of other people. In fact, he's not living in his own house. He's living in the house of some other guy because he needs to be taken care of all the time. Listen, with all our modern conveniences and prosperity, we struggle with people with special physical, mental needs. And in this time, you cannot even imagine the life that this man has had for the 10, 15, however many years. He's been sitting there dreading this moment. He has no way, he can't even run. He has no way to defend himself if the king calls him up. And it's in that context that King David calls his name, holds the power of life and death. And you've got to understand how Mephibosheth is going to hear the next words out of David's mouth. And this is what he says in verse 7. "Don't be afraid. I intend to show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields, and you will always eat meals at my table." And that's exactly what King David does. Check out verse 11. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table, just like one of the king's sons. Now remember our question. How do we treat our enemies? Mephibosheth's grandfather was King Saul. King Saul believed that David was his enemy and spent a crazy amount of time, energy, resources trying to kill him. But King David, in his turn, shows tremendous kindness, mercy, and grace to the grandson of a man who actively sought King David's death. Now, if you've been in church more than a minute, you know that we throw these words around all the time. We talk about mercy and grace, and I want to make sure that we understand what those words mean, because in this passage today, we see both. And I want us to leave here with a working understanding of what that means, both in this context and in the lives that we live, because they're very different. And mercy is simply this. Mercy is, I'm not going to give you a punishment that you deserve. In fact, if you've ever watched a trial or read the news about a trial and somebody pleads guilty or somebody's convicted and they did the crime, mercy is that person saying, I did the crime, please, out of your compassion and out of your kindness, out of your mercy, don't make me do the time. I understand that I did it. I'm remorseful. I have a family. Whatever the reason is, will you show me mercy? I don't want you to give me what I know I deserve. And Mephibosheth, by the standards of the day, by every political sensibility, deserved or at least expected death. King David doesn't kill him. That's mercy. Letting him live by the standards of the day is King David showing mercy to a man who thought that King David thought of him as an enemy. But the story doesn't stop, because King David also shows grace. And there's a two-word definition of grace that I've loved for years, and it's this. It means unmerited favor. Grace isn't just withholding a punishment that you deserve. It's actively giving a blessing that you don't deserve. And that's what King David does for Mephibosheth. I told you at least once I do it. That's what King David does for Mephibosheth. Not only does he spare his life or let him live out in the sticks. Lodabar is this tiny little place far away from the capital. Mephibosheth, most people think, is just trying to keep a low profile and hope he doesn't get called by the king. Not only does he spare his life, he says, you know what, actually, I'm going to make you rich. Saul had been a king, and David gives to Mephibosheth all of Saul's land. You got to imagine, like, that's a pretty good living. And if you read the whole passage, what you'll find is he commands Ziba, this former servant of King Saul, to serve Mephibosheth instead. So now, instead of living in somebody else's house, eating at somebody else's table, he has all the resources he needs to live out his days in comfort, which is pretty good because he can't really walk around keeping this guy comfortable. Takes more than for most people. He actually needs a hand, and now he's got it. But that's not all. King David doesn't stop there. David says, Mephibosheth, I want you to eat at my table. I am going to elevate your status. Not just someone waiting to die, not just as a wealthy landowner. I'm actually going to give you the rights and the position of a son of the king. This is a big, big deal. Mephibosheth, who thought David thought of him as an enemy, becomes, for all practical purposes, a son of the king. And David has kept his promise to his friend. Now, when it comes to our enemies, the ones we know about, and even the ones we don't know about, we can show grace as well. In fact, I try to put the message in a phrase for you each week. Here's the phrase. Be a grace starter. Be a grace starter. Because if we're going to show grace to someone, it's not something we can wait to do and hope that it happens. It's an action that we need to take. If you look back at that passage, King David is sitting there. Mephibosheth doesn't come to David and say, will you extend grace to me? David, from his palace, says, is there anyone left to whom I can show grace? David is a grace starter. And that's what I want for us. And that's what I'm going to challenge you to do. If you have enemies, if there's people on that list, show grace. Show grace to them. Jesus says, Matthew 5, he says, love your enemies. Do good to those that persecute you. And if you haven't read that, you should go there because it's amazing. He says, if you love only the people that love you, what's that? He says, aren't even pagan people doing that? And if you only bless your brothers, he says, don't even IRS agents, don't even tax collectors. Tax collectors like people that like them. He says, that's not what I want for you. I want you to love your enemies. I want you to do good to the people that persecute you. That person that thinks you think they're your enemy? What does it look like to start a relationship or an action of grace with that individual? Because all of us have those people in our lives. And here's what that could look like. I just wrote some things down. You could, if you're a Republican, this is crazy. You could buy the lunch for a Democrat. Now, let's be clear. I'm not suggesting that you use that lunch to try to get him to agree with you. That's not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise is to help that man or that woman understand you are not an enemy. And you want to show grace, unmerited favor to someone who thinks differently than you. It works the other way. If you're a Democrat, you could buy lunch for a Republican. And you could just talk. And you could just be people. You know, as I was writing this sermon, I could not get this name out of my head. I'm not giving you the name because that would be rude. But I went back before I was a pastor and I was in the business world. I was a vendor for this large healthcare system, and there was a woman in that healthcare system. She was a project manager, and she was incompetent at her job. And she was so incompetent that like every vice president with every vendor and every hospital system knew it. If your project kind of got into her wheelhouse, things just slowed down and ground to a halt. Not because she was evil, not because she was malicious or well-intended. She was just really, really bad at her job. And can I tell you that whenever I had to interact with her and whenever I interacted with other people who had to interact with her, I'm not sure that a lot of grace was shown. She was in the wrong job. There's no question. I had an opportunity to show her grace that I missed. Here's an idea. It's crazy. Let's say that you're at a gas station and you're filling up your car with gas, and a person pulls up next to you, and that person's a different color than you are. Because can we be honest? In the South, there's black people that think white people see them as an enemy, and the other way around. Sometimes it's true. Sometimes it's not. I pray that's not true for you. But a car pulls up next to you, and it's somebody that doesn't look like somebody you would normally have lunch with. Try this. Just try this. Say, hey, excuse me. My pastor said that I should do an act of kindness for somebody that I don't know. I don't know you. Can I fill up your tank with gas? See what they say. See what they say. Now, just to let you know, you can pick the size of the car. I mean, it doesn't need to be like a Ford F-350. It can be a Toyota Tercel or a little Hyundai or a Prius. I don't know what it could be, but just give that a try. You'll learn something. You'll learn something. It'll make your character more like the character of God. That person might think that you hate them. That person might not think you would give them the time of day. And you reach across and you show grace. Be a grace starter. Can I tell you, I'm just going to confess. I'm going to confess. I come up here on 65 North. I get off at 440, get on Nolensville Road. How many of you come up that way? We got a couple. I know that you come from the South. And so every time I get to the light at 440 and Nolensville Road, I'm hoping that the light is green when I pull up. Do you know why? I'm going to tell you why. Because there's almost always a homeless person or a beggar at that light. This gives me a little bit of an ethical dilemma. I'm a pastor on my way to church. How is it that I interact with a homeless person? I wonder if that person thinks that I think he's an enemy. Should I give that guy money? Should I start a conversation? Should I give him a Bible tract? Well, if you just give him money, he's going to spend it on alcohol or he's going to spend it on drugs. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe he's legitimately hungry. I don't know the story. I don't know the story that brought him there. What would it look like to actually come with a plan to give that guy some money? What would it look like if maybe a homeless person didn't need money but needed something else that's even less expensive? Eye contact or a hug. Just saying. Find a way to be a grace starter. Show grace to people that would have no reason to expect kindness from you, who might even think that you think they are your enemy. Now I'm going to tell you finish out the stories of Jill and of John, because they're actually pretty good. So Jill, this is what happened. We had a policy at that particular church that basically any pastor could give away about $300 from the benevolence fund if he thought there was a need. I'm sitting across from this woman like, why would I not help her for less than $300? And so I said, well, I listed her whole story. She needed an electric bill paid. I don't remember how much it was, but it wasn't $300 because I paid it. Like, well, let me just pay that bill. Do you know, she didn't expect that. And it started a relationship with her that continued for some time because we had her over to my house. Our family would interact with her and with her two sons. They swam in our pool. Not only that, in a culture where hospitality is everything, she invited us to her home. And she served us dinner. Can I help you? I'm just going to help you with this. If a Jordanian national says, would you like to come to my house so that I can cook Jordanian food for you? The correct answer to that question is yes. I mean, if you're invited somewhere fancy, delay it and go to that. I mean, that was amazing. And so we would spend time with her, and we got to know her, and we helped her out a little bit financially. And it's the most interesting thing. She said, what you let me do that I never expected you to let me do? She said, you let me pick up your son. He was real small. He's like, 1 or 2 years old. This is a bunch of years ago. And we would let her hold Derek. And to her, that communicated dignity and worth and grace. We gave her something that she didn't deserve and didn't expect. It wasn't long before I'm in John's barber chair, And I'm just kind of thinking the things that I'm thinking. And for whatever reason, I have no idea, he unprompted starts to tell me his story. And it turns out that my suspicion about his orientation is absolutely correct. And he started telling me about it. And he told me about how he got into that lifestyle. I'm thinking, and I'm putting it all through a filter in my mind. And then the conversation just turned in a way I totally did not see coming. Because this is what he says. He says, but you know, I become convicted of that behavior. And I know that it's wrong, and I've repented. So I've been in church every day. He went to a Catholic church near there, and he just keeps telling me the story. I don't have to say anything. He's just talking. And it come to find out that in that little Great Clips shop, there was a coworker that had extended an extraordinary amount of grace to John and helped him meet Jesus, gave him a place to stay as he was trying to reorient his life. You know what he told me his greatest need was at that time? He said, I'm just looking for godly men who can teach me how to be one because I've never known any. Not because of my grace or my judgment sitting there in the chair, but because of the grace of a coworker. People don't expect kindness from us. And here's what I want to tell you. And I'm going to ask Jeremy, come on back up. We're going to wrap up here in just a minute. Here's the season at this church is changing. The church at Woodbine is going to be something different in the next weeks, months, and years. What is it that we want to be known for? Not what we're against. I think people hear that too much. I think that when people who aren't Christ followers hear about Christ followers, what they hear is what we hate. And what they don't see is what we love. And what they don't see is us extending grace to them because God has extended grace to us. I mean, David extended grace to Mephibosheth. And Mephibosheth didn't deserve it, and neither do we. People don't expect kindness. What would it look like if you found one of those names that's in your head that I challenged you at the beginning of the service, and you find a way to show grace, unmerited favor, kindness that's unexpected and undeserved to those individuals? You know what happened to Gada? Jill told all her friends, all her Muslim friends, you told me not to go to the church, that they wouldn't help me. But I went there, and they were kind. And I'd love to tell you that Jill one day came to a church service and confessed Christ. That's not how that story ended, as far as I know. We kind of lost touch. We moved. She moved. But I know what she told her friends because she told me what she told them. And John, that guy in the barber chair, he won't shut up talking about Jesus because somebody showed him kindness and introduced him to a relationship with God that he knew that he needed. Didn't call into account his sin or the things that were obviously wrong. The judgment that he was expecting was replaced with kindness. What would it look like if our church was filled with that kind of story, with people like that? Be a grace starter. It starts with you, it starts with me, and it starts with grace.